Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today we're going to Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. That town, most of you students of the Civil War know, was unceremoniously burned by Confederate soldiers raiding the place in July of 1864. We don't think so much about the fact that Chambersburg was in fact raided several times during the war. The first raid happened in October of 1862. It ended without the city being burned. On that evening of October 10th of 1862, three citizens came out to meet a Confederate cavalry column, part of an 1,800-man cavalry force that was led by Jeb Stewart. One of those citizens is pictured here. His name is Alexander Kelly McClure. He was a prominent newspaper editor. He was a politician. He was also a major in the Adjutant General's Office of the United States, appointed by Lincoln to recruit Union soldiers in his part of Pennsylvania. Well, he was a little worried about that. McClure was worried that he'd get in trouble by the Confederates. Well, Jeb Stewart gave the town over to one of his subordinates, Brigadier General Wade Hampton, and McClure was part of that three-person committee that surrendered the town to Hampton. During the negotiations, McClure talked about his service in the U.S. Army, and Hampton said, "Listen, my best advice to you is to go back to your home." And McClure had quite a large home with large land holdings and animals and all of that. Go to your home outside of Chambersburg and wait there. We won't hurt you. If any Confederates attempt to arrest you, if they find out that you're a Union officer and try to bother you in any way, you let me know, and I'll make sure they don't. So McClure decided to do that. He wrote about his experience after departing Hampton, and I want to read this passage because it speaks a little bit about McClure's character, about what McClure cared about, his home, his surroundings, and it also speaks about Hampton and his men. It gives you a really great picture into what life was like to be a Confederate raider on that day in October of 1862. So let me read it to you now. Remember, here's McClure telling his story. He starts by reflecting on his land and his animals. He says, "With 60 acres of corn and shock and 3 barns full of grain, remember it's the fall, excellent farm and saddle horses, and a number of best-blooded cattle, the question of property was worthy of a thought. I resolved to stay, as I felt so bound by the terms of surrender, and take my chances of discovery and parole. I started in advance of them, the Confederates, for my house, but not in time to save the horses. I confidently expected to be overrun by them, the Confederates, and to find the place one scene of desolation in the morning. I resolved, however, that things should be done soberly, if possible, and I had just time to destroy all the liquors about the house. As their pickets were all around me, I could not get it off. I finished just in time, for they were soon out upon me in force, and every house in the barn, 10 in all, was promptly equipped and mounted by a rebel cavalryman. All of his horses are gone. They, the cavalryman, on his horses passed on toward Shippensburg, McClure tells us, leaving a picket force on the road. McClure thought he was in the clear, that the cavalry had passed. But in an hour, McClure continues, they returned with all the horses they could find and dismounted to spend the night on the turnpike in front of my door. It was now midnight, and I sat on the porch observing their movements. They had my best cornfield beside them, and their horses fared well. In a little while, one entered the yard, came up to me, and after a profound bow, politely asked for a few coals to start a fire. I supplied him and informed him as blandly as possible where he could find wood conveniently, as I had dim visions of campfires made of my palings. I was thanked in return, and the mild-mannered villain proceeded at once to strip the fence and kindle fires. Soon after, a squad came and asked permission to get some water. I piloted them to the pump and again received a profusion of thanks. Communication having been opened between us, squads followed each other closely for water, but each called and asked permission before getting in and promptly left the yard. I was somewhat bewildered by this uniform courtesy and supposed it but the prelude to a general movement upon everything eatable in the morning. It was not a grateful reflection that my beautiful mountain trout, from 12 to 20 inches long, sporting in the spring, would probably grace the rebel breakfast table, that the blooded calves in the yard beside them would most likely go with the trout, and the dwarf pears had, I felt assured, abundant promise of early relief from their golden burdens. About 1 o'clock, half a dozen officers came to the door and asked to have some coffee made for them, offering to pay liberally for it in Confederate scrip. After concluding a treaty with them on behalf of the colored servants, coffee was promised them, and they then asked for a little bread with it. They were wet and shivering, and seeing a bright open wood fire in the library, they asked permission to enter and warm themselves until their coffee should be ready, assuring me that under no circumstances should anything in the house be disturbed by their men. I had no alternative but to accept them as my guests until it might please them to depart, and I did so with as good grace as possible. Once seated around the fire, all reserve seemed to be forgotten on their part, and they opened a general conversation on politics, the war, the different battles, the merits of generals of both armies, etc. They spoke with entire freedom upon every subject, but their movement into Chambersburg. Most of them were men more than of ordinary intelligence and culture, and their demeanor was in all respects eminently courteous. I took a cup of coffee with them and have seldom seen anything more keenly relished. They said that they had not tasted coffee for weeks before, and that then they had paid from $6 to $10 per pound for it. When they were through, they asked whether there was any coffee left, and finding that there was some, they proposed to bring some more officers and a few privates who were prostrated by exposure to get what was left. They were, of course, as welcome as those present, and on they came in squads of 5 or more until every grain of browned coffee was exhausted. Then they asked for tea, and that was served to some 20 more. In the meantime, a subordinate officer had begged of me a little bread for himself and a few men, and he was supplied in the kitchen. He was followed by others in turn until nearly 100 had been supplied with something to eat or drink. All, however, politely asked permission to enter the house and behaved with entire propriety. They did not make a single rude or profane remark, even to the servants. In the meantime, the officers who had first entered the house had filled their pipes from the box of Kiliknikik on the mantel, after being assured that smoking was not offensive, and we had another hour of free talk on matters generally. At 4 o'clock in the morning, the welcome blast of the bugle was heard, and they rose hurriedly to depart. Thanking me for the hospitality they had received, we parted, mutually expressing the hope that should we ever meet again, it would be under more pleasant circumstances. In a few minutes, they were mounted and moved into Chambersburg. So there you have it, the story, the eyewitness account of Alexander K. McClure, a newspaper editor, politician, and U.S. Army major of the day, Confederate cavalry under General Jeb Stewart and Brigadier General Wade Hampton came for a visit. Thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.